Well, good afternoon, Secretary of State Dominic Raab. I'd like to say you're very welcome indeed at our first meeting with the Lords EU Select Committee. Occasionally we have, I hope, a contribution to make. We're very much looking forward to your contribution. And if I may say, without loading this with too much editorial, we appreciate the enthusiasm you have given to your new duties since your appointment, and we hope that they will bear fruit. I hope this will be a constructive suggestion about how the negotiations are going, the difficult issues and matters which we will obviously want to keep under review as they develop. Can I get one issue, as it were, out of the way first, briefly? We originally extended an invitation to Ollie Robbins as the Prime Minister's advisor to come alongside you, and we noticed that last month he appeared before two House of Commons select committees. Well, we're not in a business of me too, but we normally expect a sort of similar response, and I just wondered if you could comment at all on why he's declined to appear and how we should take this forward.
Well, thank you, Lord Boswell, and can I thank you and the members of your committee for the opportunity to come and give evidence. I've been looking forward to it for some time, and I appreciate you all taking time out of recess to do so. In relation to the Ollie Robbins situation, you'll have seen the written ministerial statement. I think we felt it was very important to have one track in the negotiations, and within Whitehall, the Prime Minister, as ever, leads the negotiations. I deputise for her. We have shifted slightly the Whitehall arrangements, as you'll have seen in the written statement, and I'm working very collaboratively with Ollie. I think in relation to select committee appearances, on the basis of the old adage that advisers advise and ministers decide, I think we certainly feel in principle, actually, ministers should come and be accountable to you and to committees in general, and that's the approach that we intend to take from here on in, and that's something that both at departmental level, at Whitehall level, and certainly at ministerial level, we agreed rather easily.
Well, thank you for that. Unless you would like just to pick up the fact that there appears to be an anomaly in the practice between the two houses, or in your treatment of the two houses.
Well, can I please beg your forgiveness for any anomaly, but in a way you will be the prototype practice ground for the new arrangements, which are the correct ones. Right. So I hope that gives you some reassurance.
I think we'll reflect further on that and then pass on, because there are, in a sense, even more important matters to discuss. I think I'd like simply to ask you to give a sit-rep on the state of play with the negotiations, any changes of pace that you detect. An interesting article in The Guardian today, where you've met Monsieur Barnier a number of times, and you've shown your readiness to do so, suggesting, and I'm not saying we necessarily buy that, but there's some suggestion he may not be as available to you as you would like to be to him, and give us a general flavour of how that is going, what moving into continuous negotiations means in practice, and how you see it going forward towards the autumn decision time.
Well, thank you. And firstly, in relation to whatever tittle-tattle may appear in whatever newspaper, I shall be over in Brussels tomorrow evening for a long, substantive meeting on Friday. I hope that gives you the facts. Directly with Michel Barnier. I hope that gives you the facts. We've, I think, on a one-to-one level, established rather quickly a good professional and personal rapport. It's not really ever about the two individuals, but to the extent that those issues matter, I would say we have a good working relationship, and it's early days, but the beginnings of a good personal relationship. And for those like Lord Jay, who have been in the diplomatic game for much longer than I have, notwithstanding my previous experience at the SO, these things matter. In terms of the substance, as you've said, Lord Boswell, I think it is important as we enter the final phase of the negotiations in the lead up to the October Council and the possibility that it may creep beyond that. We want to see some renewed energy. We're bringing the ambition and the substance of our white paper on the future relationship, and Also, I think some pragmatism to try and go the extra mile to get the deal that I think is in both sides' interest. We need that to be matched, obviously. It's a negotiation. In relation to the constituent parts of that, on the withdrawal agreement, as has been, I think, repeated by both sides in the negotiations, broadly 80%, depends how you measure it, but it is concluded or, as text. The outstanding separation issues vary from precisely the detail of the dispute resolution, the governance provisions. There's some outstanding issues on data sharing and on the administrative procedures, and there's some other issues. What I would say to you, and I hope this will give you some reassurance, is that actually most of that is detail rather than on the principal issues, and I think that the contours of an agreement are there. On top of the withdrawal agreement, obviously we've agreed the terms of the implementation period. That's important for business certainty, but also I think for some finality to the process for the average citizen who looks on and wonders how long is this all going to go on for. There's also the issue of the Northern Ireland Protocol, and I would say whilst we haven't got a definitive solution to that yet, you will have seen, and your committee will have seen, the proposal by the EU, the proposals that we've put forward, and our shared commitment to give effect to the undertakings in the joint report back in December. And on the future relationship, well, I would draw on the white paper, both on the economic partnership, on which, yes, we've had questions, but not a dismissal of the principal grounds for the new relationship. There's been good progress on security cooperation, and we want to make sure that we continue that valued operational security capabilities that we share. And there are other issues around governance, which on our model would be similar to the governance arrangements as we have for the withdrawal agreement. But obviously there's a difference in the sense that the withdrawal agreement covers citizens' rights, which is a special set of issues. I think that's the best overview I can give you. Only to add, I'm confident that a deal is within our sights. We're bringing ambition, pragmatism, energy, and I expect it will be, and if it is matched, we get a deal.
Thank you. Can I just go back to the timetable for a moment? As I understand it, the critical points are, first of all, the informal meeting of ministers in council formation in Salzburg in September. Then the original idea was to reach agreement in October on the conclusion of the withdrawal agreement. You've already indicated, in a somewhat throwaway line, that it may go a bit further than that. Could we just ask you to be a little clearer as to the timescale, not least because, of course, there's the whole issue of legal implementation in the UK with the withdrawal bill and the parallel issue about approval and there's the withdrawal, obviously there's the definitive votes within Parliament and also the European Parliament's acceptance of the deal. How is it looking to you at the moment?
So my starting point is the end point. I want to begin with the end in mind, which is March of next year when we will leave the EU, and I work back from then. And you rightly raised the question of the legislative framework that will be needed to implement any deal that we do, and that is the real driver, I think, for the UK side, but you've also referred quite rightly to the EU processes and procedures on their side. We're aiming for the October Council, but there is some measure of leeway.
Thank you. Can I just also ask a little bit about the flavour of the negotiations, and then I'll conclude and let colleagues come in. You've understandably talked about, as it were, your personal interface with Mr. Barnier as the Commission's negotiator. At what might be called the technical level, I take it that the pace of if not negotiations, discussions has continued and intensified within both DEXU and other Whitehall departments with their counterparts in the Commission, looking at some of the practical implications. That's, as it were, one issue. And a separate one, which is raised from time to time, is the question about who you're negotiating with. Is there and what should we read into it, if there is, any shift in the focus away from the Commission and towards the EU 27 states? Is there any pressure for from individual EU member states for the Commission to soften its stance? I mean, to put it in simplistic terms, the negotiations are now immediate and real and have to come to a conclusion of one kind or another. That means that if a deal is to be found, it has to be found. How is that going forward, and how much is it that people are facilitating that or pressing for it over and beyond the, as it were, formal positions of the two negotiating parties?
Well, thank you. First of all, you're absolutely right. The technical teams, as opposed to the political principles, which is the way we frame it. On our side, Ollie Robbins doing a smashing job with an excellent team and meeting up with his counterparts on the EU side. That work is very intense. They had a very limited period off in August, which is rare by Brussels standards, I think might be observed, which shows the commitment on both sides. And that's obviously necessary to tee up the intensification of the meetings of the political principles. There's not much point in having those meetings unless the groundwork's been paved. In relation to the distinction between the Commission and the Task Force 50 and the other EU member states, obviously we need a deal that we strike and that we're confident and optimistic we can strike to gain broad agreement, otherwise it won't be ratified. And naturally, at a bilateral level, those conversations go on. And I've met with Simon Coveney on the Irish side, the French and the Swedish Europe ministers. But I want to be very clear that from our point of view, the central negotiation runs through the team in Brussels and with Michel Barnier, and that obviously we want to make as much progress as we can through that channel, and we're 110% committed to it. The negotiation takes place through that channel. But obviously, as the issues are raised by bilateral partners within the EU and beyond the EU, obviously we want to talk through our position and make it clear. And
just as it were, for the record, that enthusiasm and that focus, as it were, on the two parties, the negotiation is reciprocated on the Task Force 50 side. They want to get it sorted.
I would... Sorry, just to spell out the question.
Yeah, I mean, what I was thinking... I mean,
slightly reticent about speaking for Michel Barnier.
No, I do understand that. I was just making the point that you've emphasised, and I, of course, accept that, your enthusiasm to get the thing dealt with and to deal with the people whom the EU has appointed, mandated to deal with it. That is on behalf of the European Union. And we then said, there may be a question of individual member states with their own input or their own pressures that they want to get. But your impression, I'm thinking back slightly to this morning's press report to which I referred, is that, generally speaking, the Task Force 50 and Michel Barnier as the lead negotiator reciprocate on wanting to get a deal and in the way that you have expressed in terms of British interest.
Look, if I blinked every time there was a snotty media report, I'd never do anything else. The fact is, I think it was Michel who described the negotiations as being one that will move now into continuous negotiation. I obviously agree with that. And on the basis that you should judge governments and other political bodies about what they do, not what they say, always think it's a fairly healthy rule of thumb. We've had 3 meetings directly, Michel and myself, since my appointment. I'm going out for a further extended meeting Thursday night, but in order to see the Barnier team on Friday morning. I think you can judge us by our actions, and you can judge Michel and his team by theirs, which is clearly wanting to intensify the engagement and reach a positive deal for both sides.
Well, if I might just conclude my remarks with saying, looking at the press reports of the media reports of the press conference, I think on 26th of July, as it were, it did appear that you were both congruent in wanting to move towards a deal, and, if I may put it, being relatively positive about concluding one.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Correct.
I'll stop there and invite Lord Jay to come on to the next
area.
Lord Chairman, and welcome to the job, Secretary of State. There's nothing like a tough negotiation to get the adrenaline flowing. I wanted to ask a couple of questions about Ireland, which is always really, from the start and indeed before the referendum, seemed to me to be the most difficult of Brexit issues, if only because it's not one which can easily be sorted out with sort of clever people round a table without going wrong. Those concerns, I have to say, have been magnified rather than corrected by visits to Dublin and to Belfast and most recently to the border. But in that context, I think we were interested in the White Paper's assertion that the proposed UK-EU economic partnership, and I quote, would see the UK and the EU meet their commitments to Northern Ireland through the overall future relationship. I just wondered if you could say a bit about how that would work. The conclusion is that the backstop wouldn't need to be used if that were to work, how it would work, and what are the implications given that on the EU side they seem to think that those arrangements wouldn't be satisfactory.
Well, thank you. It's absolutely right to say that I think the UK's position has been all along that the issue of Northern Ireland becomes easier to resolve, as technically complex as it is, when we move to thinking about the future state. That's been the long-standing position. And that's because of the aim to devise a set of proposals which would minimise friction of any sort at the border, and obviously that has a direct read across. And I think the proposals in the White Paper for the future relationship with the EU would ensure that the backstop solution as part of the withdrawal agreement wouldn't need to be brought into effect. At the same time, and I want to be clear about this because it will be important for the EU side and it's a commitment we made, we remain committed to turning all of the commitments made under the joint report into legally binding text. The Prime Minister's been clear both on that commitment but also that the EU's proposals were unacceptable, mainly because of the effect they would have on the UK common market and the constitutional integrity of the UK. Our counter-proposal on the customs element of a temporary backstop was the temporary customs arrangement, and that will ensure that if a customs arrangement with the EU is not in place by the end of the IEP, there will be no default customs border between Northern Ireland and Ireland, or between Northern Ireland and the rest of Great Britain. So what we have in mind is a very specific set of circumstances, and the backstop will be time limited. Now, this is an area where there's been a lot of work ongoing at the technical level. I don't have the solution to give you yet, but we are committed to, on both sides, to giving effect to the joint report. And I would also want to affirm our confidence that the proposals that we've set out for the future relationship provide a good basis on which to resolve this issue on a sustainable basis.
I mean, it's always encouraging to hear that technical solutions are about to be found or about to be presented to us, but the gap seems to be between the sort of various technical proposals which are put forward and the reality on the ground, which is pretty worrying. I mean, under the White Paper proposals, would there need to be some sort of checks on the border, and if so, what sort of checks, and how can you have any sort of physical checks which don't run the risk of really potentially quite serious consequences? I mean, I think that's the issue which we find quite difficult to grasp.
Well, first of all, just to say, I think that you juxtapose the dry legalism of proposals with their impact on the ground very well, and this is a point that I will continue to make. And one of the frustrations from the UK side has been with the legalism of the EU versus the impact it would have on communities on the ground, both in the north of the border but also, in fairness, south of the border. So I think that ought to be the starting and indeed the end point of the check as to whether we've got a viable, workable solution. It's about the impact it would have. We've made clear we would see no return to the hard border or additional infrastructure. I think, in fairness, Michel Barnier has also confirmed that he's open to new solutions on the backstop, and he said that the backstop that the that we eventually agree is not necessarily going to be the one that the Commission came up with, and he's acknowledged that it can be amended and improved. So there's a lot of technical work still underway. I'm not going to either give you a solution today, unfortunately, or give away the integrity of the negotiation room. But what I can say is that we're both committed, and there's a lot of interesting technical, innovative work going on to make sure we resolve it. But again, I come back to the point you've made, Lord Jay, which is that it's got to work for those communities.
Mm-hmm. I mean, just the final point. I mean, there's been a bit of discussion about a sort of possible dual backstop with a Northern Ireland specific one and a UK one, but done on a different legal basis, so that it wouldn't it would meet the overall the basic concerns which you have and the Commission have. Is that the sort of thing which you're sort of negotiating about?
Well, again, tempting as it is, I'm not going to give away the negotiation room, but we haven't ruled anything out in terms of the model. What we've just talked about, and I think in the way you've described, is the consequences. We're not going to see a customs border drawn down the RSC. We're not going to do anything which would imperil the Belfast Agreement. And we want to make sure, in a positive sense, that the solution works for the communities on both sides. And obviously, we're very mindful of the political situation and the human situation, frankly, in Northern Ireland.
Yeah. Thank you.
Well, thank you for that. And I'm going to bring Baroness Sutty in for some related questions in a moment. Perhaps I can add one comment of my own. I'm very pleased to hear you talk about communities, and of course, I take it as embracing communities of both confessions in that, as well as their geographic location, north or south of the border, because it sometimes seems to me that the local communities, I mean, the ability to go across without let or hindrance, which of course was curtailed during the Troubles, and the interests of farmers, say, with land on both sides of the border, tend otherwise to get overlooked at a time when we're looking at Dublin, Belfast and London, Brussels negotiations. And I read what you say as being slightly indicative that there is a sensitivity towards the actual situation on the ground, as well as that in what might be termed the political debate.
Well, there must be, Lord Boswell, I think you're absolutely right that we must have that sensitivity, and Lord Jay's made a similar point. This is talking about real people, real livelihoods, real communities, and we have a history, and we want to be looking forward, not in any way backwards. So that is very much at the forefront of my mind, and in particular making sure that no section of the communities feel left behind or overlooked. That must be right.
Thank you. Baroness Sutton.
Thank you, Lord Chairman. Can I just continue down the line that Lord Jay was taking you earlier on a very specific question? Would the government be willing to accept an element of ongoing jurisdiction from EU institutions and the Court of Justice of the EU in Northern Ireland?
Well, I think the idea of any jurisdiction of the European Court, it would be very difficult. But obviously, given the sensitivities on both sides, what I would want to do is avoid setting any fresh red lines or any new red lines beyond the very clear parameters of the negotiations that we've already set out. Because we're going to need to come up with something rather innovative, I suspect, to deal with this situation. And whilst the EU, because it's bound by a legalism which may at times on our side feel frustrating, actually has in its past proved rather innovative. So I'm not convinced that this isn't something that can be resolved. In fact, I'm persuaded that we can resolve it. But I don't think it's likely to be bringing in the jurisdiction of the ECJ in perhaps the way you framed it.
And if I move on now to the Customs Union, or the Customs Union, if Northern Ireland were to remain a member of a Customs Union, would Northern Ireland be included in any international agreements that were subsequently concluded by the UK?
Well, I think our position on this has always been precisely for, I think, the subsequent questions that you would raise, that we need to have a UK-wide approach for customs, precisely because you couldn't otherwise see a way of averting a customs border down the Irish Sea, which, as the Prime Minister's made clear, is not on the cards.
And the final question is on the UK-EU mapping exercise. When are you going to share that on the conclusions of the mapping exercise and North-South cooperation?
Well, the mapping exercise has been going well. I need to get a final readout of the timeframes and the timescales, and perhaps I suspect we'll have a list of follow-up points at the end of this session if
you could inform the committee afterwards.
If members have done their job correctly, and perhaps I could add that to it so that I can give you the final word on where we've got to and the most recent up-to-date word on that.
That's fine, and if I may say, please regard this as an open dialogue, and as and when things become available you want to share with us, do so.
Very good.
Lord Little.
One very quick Northern Ireland point. The Commission was very critical of the government's proposal for a backstop on the grounds that it was temporary. Right? Is that still the government's position, that any backstop would be temporary?
Oh, I think we would need to see to avoid a situation where the backstop became some indeterminate, indefinite limbo. Otherwise, it would involve, and the risk, obviously, for the UK side, when we come before your House and the House of Commons, would be that people would say, well, there's no real incentive here to move to the treaty-based future relationship. So I think it is important that it's finite and temporary and bluntly short, and I've imparted that, as the Prime Minister has, to our interlocutors on the other side.
Lord Whitty.
Two quick thoughts on Northern Ireland. One on the sequence. Because Northern Ireland was put into the withdrawal treaty, is it still the case, if everything has not been sorted, including the backstop of Northern Ireland, then we will not have a withdrawal treaty in time for January or March, whichever time you think is a deadline on that. The second thing, and perhaps more specific, is on the border. There was some publicity given to remarks by Mr. Rees-Mogg recently. Can we have your assurance that in no circumstances does the government envisage individuals being stopped at the border in any circumstances?
Thank you. First of all, you raise a very good point about EU law in relation to the backstop, because as a matter of law under Article 50, there are constraints on the period of time for which a backstop could last. Now, obviously, ultimately that has to be tested, but I don't think the concerns about the temporary nature of the backstop, to the extent that it derives from the withdrawal agreement, are purely on the UK side, that there is a legal issue for the EU there as well. On the broader point, there is the UK's position and the EU's position is there's no deal until we've got the whole deal, and that will include the withdrawal agreement, the protocol on Northern Ireland, and indeed a workable and substantive political declaration on the future relationship. And look, I'm not going to respond to comments from Jacob Rees-Mogg or anyone else. They can speak for themselves. We've been very clear that in the event of a no-deal scenario, we would not return to the hard border, and I think that's been those or extra infrastructure at the border, and I think those comments have also been echoed on the Republic side as well.
Thank you. Darren Smith.
Secretary of State, leaving the Irish problems at one side, I'd just like to focus on the other outstanding issues in relation to the withdrawal agreement. I've got a couple of specifics to ask you on that, but if you could just outline what you regard as the bigger issues to be resolved. You said earlier, I think, that it was almost there, but what is actually causing the trouble in not getting to a final position?
Well, as you'll know, in June we published a joint statement setting out the progress that we've made in agreeing the draft withdrawal agreement, and we described the articles that had been agreed since March. We've locked down the text on the majority of other separation issues and taken with the agreement reached in March on the implementation period, on citizens' rights, on financial settlement. That's where the 80% figure comes from. Now, there are some remaining outstanding issues, including data sharing, police and judicial cooperation in criminal matters, some of the governance arrangements, basically dispute resolution. But in each of those cases, whenever I look at them again, the contours of a resolution are all there. The principles are broadly agreed. It's some of the technical detail just to get it over the line. But I'm confident that the agreement on the withdrawal agreement subject to the adage that there's no deal until we've got the whole deal, and that includes the other components, actually is well within our sights.
So could I just press you, because we've been given these headings for some time of the areas where agreement has not been finalised. We just take, for example, data transfers. What is it that is not agreed, that is holding up the agreement? Just what at a granular level is it that's so difficult to agree?
Well, the data sharing proposals under EU law and adequacy notices are rather complex. Again, I'm not going to open up the negotiating room on an ongoing basis and give real-time commentary on it, because that will distract from the work we've got to do. But all I would say to you is I'm confident, and our team is confident, that we will get that over the line. But data sharing is very technical, very complicated, and what we're trying to make sure is we cover all of the potential scenarios in a way which is responsible on all sides.
So there are no political issues involved in getting agreement on data sharing?
I don't think I would describe them as political, although there's a political undercurrent that runs right through these negotiations. But no, I wouldn't describe them as fundamentally political in nature.
Okay. Let me move on to the couple of specifics. And the first is in relation to the financial settlement, where the issue is, assuming we get to the withdrawal agreement and it's ratified in time, will we be paying the full amount of the financial commitment, whatever is in the final version of the agreements? And that includes, I think, the political declaration as the future intent, i.e. is that regarded as completely settled or as still open for further discussion?
Well, it's probably someone from Brussels trying to check in on the money. I think the way I would describe it is we've agreed the financial settlement as set out in the withdrawal agreement and has been well publicised, but we've always said there's no deal until we've got the whole deal. In relation to the future relationship, clearly, if we turned up without a credible future relationship set of proposals in the political declaration, and without being able to give the reassurance that they are likely to be transferred in a reasonably expeditious time frame, I think it would make selling the package as a whole much harder. I think this is something that's understood on the other side, and so we will want to make sure that there's a clear linkage and that the deal and the package is viewed as one package. But what we expect is to get the deal and for both sides to fully implement their obligations under it.
So if we take the UK government's position, what would be regarded as a less than acceptable outcome in the final package that will be agreed that would cause the UK government to re-examine the amount that should be paid?
Well, I think that what we're looking for in the future, in the political declaration of the future relationship, is clear choice of the model that we want to see going forward of our economic partnership, but also our security cooperation. We've obviously set out in our white paper an ambitious, innovative and also pragmatic set of proposals. We'll want to see a level of detail which gives, I think, reassurance that this is the choice that has been made. The next step will be putting it into effect. And I think we'll want to make sure that there's clear linkage and the golden thread running through the three components of the deal, that they are linked and that they are viewed, if not sequentially, in chronological terms, but actually as part of the overarching bargain, deal, agreement that we come to with our EU partners and friends.
Could I just interpose for a second on the financial obligations? Because I know you made some comments on this some time ago. If there is no deal, we can debate that, but just consider that scenario for a moment. Would you accept that there are historic financial obligations which will require discharge, and any reduction in the bill will relate to any future obligations which we no longer have to undertake? I mean, there is a certain sort of functional consideration there, and I just wondered if you'd like to comment on that.
Well, I know Lord Jay would pick me up if I didn't say, as a former Foreign Office legal advisor, of course I would say that Her Majesty's government in the United Kingdom always pays its dues. Equally,
I think that's quite welcome to the committee. Thank you.
Equally, the financial settlement as it's calibrated in the withdrawal agreement reflects a whole range of considerations, not just the strict legal obligations. And If we left with no deal, then not only would there be a question around quite what the shape of those financial obligations were as a matter of strict law, but secondly on the timing. Remember that the timing of payments is actually, I think we overlook it on our side, rather important on the EU side because of the way money is distributed. But what's agreed I don't think it could be safely assumed on anyone's side that the financial settlement would, as has been agreed as part of the withdrawal agreement, would then just be paid in precisely the same shape or speed or rate if there was no deal. As I said, that would be a peculiar position for the UK to take because we view the package as a whole.
Thank you.
But do you regard there's any variability in the amount that might be paid in the event of a deal, which may not be as good a deal as the government would wish, say in accordance with Chequers?
I think once we get to the stage of agreeing the package with the three components, we will then be in the position of signing up to it. Now, with any deal, both sides need to comply with their obligations, otherwise there are consequences. But if we've reached an agreement and we've signed up to it, I think that would be the financial settlement as set out in the withdrawal agreement would apply, subject to the variations.
So whatever is in the final agreement, come what may.
Well, no, because we wouldn't be signing up to the deal as a whole unless we were satisfied that it was a good deal. So there's no come what may about it. Just to be clear.
Okay. Then my final point is whether you could update us on the state of negotiations with Spain regarding Gibraltar.
Well, there's not much concrete reporting I can give you back, other than to say that we're working very closely with the government in Spain to make sure that we safeguard the position on both sides of the border, but also in particular, obviously, from the UK point of view, the people of Gibraltar. So we will continue with that, and we're confident that we can get the right solution, the right outcome.
Sorry, Lord Chairman, can I just
Yes,
ask,
please.
What do you believe is Spain's agenda around Gibraltar? What do you think they're trying to achieve, and is that a way? Can we meet that in some way, or some of it?
Well, I'm certainly confident we can get a solution, but I'm not going to start imputing intentions or motivations to the other side in the negotiation. I always find that to be counterproductive. I assume good faith on all sides.
Thank you. At which point I think we'll move on to Lord Cannell.
Thank you very much, Lord Chairman. And welcome also, Secretary of State. And perhaps I can bring you back to the 12th of July White Paper. I wondered what your analysis has been so far of the responses of both EU institutions and member states so far.
Well, I think I would start with the joint commitment that we've made, echoed by Michel Barnier, to define an ambitious partnership between the UK and the EU, and in his word, one that has no precedent. Now, we recognise that that's quite difficult for the EU. It's quite a legalistic machine. I say that as a lawyer with great passion for legal principle, but and therefore doing things slightly differently. It's not a particularly malleable institution, but as I mentioned before, actually it has done some of its, I think, rather more interesting and innovative work when it has been pragmatic about some of these things. And it's good to see that on the EU side, them accepting that we'll need to do something without precedent. I think also, in my most recent 2 press conferences with Michel Barnier, he's used the language of wanting to have an arrangement which, at a, if I could call it a theological level, respects the autonomy of the UK and the EU, but looks to forge a relationship based on collaboration and cooperation. And that's precisely the paradigm that we both, that on our side we adhere to, and I think that that's mapped out in the white paper. So we've certainly had a series of questions back and forth with Task Force 50 on practical implications, but from my point of view, when people are questioning the practical questions or the pragmatic considerations, they're not ruling out the model as a question of principle. So I think that's useful. Beyond the Commission, we've also engaged widely with Member States in the way that I described, because we want to make sure that there's clarity about our proposals, whilst respecting that the negotiation track runs through Brussels and Michel Barnier's team. I mentioned, I think, that I'd spoken to met with Natalie Loiseau, Anna Lind, Sweden, Simon Coveney, and I think there's a lot of interest. There's also some questions, but there's a lot of interest. And I think, which is positive from the UK perspective, a recognition that we've made not only an interesting set of substantive proposals, but clearly ones which have involved political compromises and pragmatism. That's the reason that you're hearing from me at this select committee rather than my predecessor. And therefore, some of that pragmatism that is necessary to reach an agreement needs to be matched on the other side. And there's been some other, I sort of always, again, reluctant to speak for anyone else, but given that it's in the public domain, I thought that the Latvian Foreign Minister, Edgars Rinkovics, who told the Today programme in August that the Chequers plan constituted good ground for really trying hard to reach a deal. I thought that was positive. The Danish Finance Minister also talked about the White Paper as setting out realistic proposal for good negotiations. So in the round, there's still some hard yards to do on the future relationship for sure. But actually, I think it's had a reasonably positive landing. We're getting a lot of constructive engagement, and as I said, a lot of talk about the practical considerations rather than in principle dismissal. And I think that's valuable from our point of view.
Thank you very much. That's very helpful. There's a lot of follow-ups that spring to mind, but I wonder if I could just put two to you. Firstly, is that the committee was in fact in Brussels around the 16th of July, and that was exactly the time the House of Commons passed its amendments on the taxation cross-border trade bill. And in various of the meetings, and in particular with Michel Barnier, the issue of the amendments came up, and the interlocutors were concerned that the amendments themselves as a chunk, and in one case, the customs one, really stood in the way of the government being able to get its vision, as seen in the 12th July White Paper, to a successful conclusion. What would you say to that?
Well, we had some questions on that, but fortunately now we're in August, a month later, we've had the opportunity to clarify that none of those amendments would undermine the vision or the model in the White Paper. And also, actually, for all the sort of din that you get around parliamentary votes, whether in the House of Lords or the House of Commons, actually it was quite a good opportunity to reinforce the fact that we don't just have a Conservative and Unionist government, but we also have a Unionist Parliament, because on some of those amendments, in fact on all the amendments that would have risked the concern that we have around a customs border on the Irish Sea, Parliament clearly supported the government's position. So you have a Unionist Parliament as well as a Conservative and Unionist government, and that was, I think it's another illustration of the opportunity that we've taken since you were there in July, over the following month or so, to explain both what's happening in the House of Commons, but why the White Paper is calibrated and configured in the way it is.
And that's also very helpful, and thank you. My final sort of probe really is in respect of what the 12th of July White Paper had to say about a common rule book, a sort of epithet phrase which is used several times. And I wondered whether you could tell us a bit more of what that means in practice, and also how it really differs from simply being adhering to an EU rule book.
Well, I'm very grateful to take that opportunity. So the free trade area that we envisage would involve a common rule book for goods, and effectively we make an upfront choice to, by treaty, agree to align with the EU rules on goods and agri-food. There would also be a common rule book with the EU on state aid, which will be enforced nonetheless by the Competition and Markets Authority here in the UK. That's a good illustration of some of the institutional changes that we'll need to make on our side to get ready for life outside the EU. Parliament would have oversight over the incorporation of those rules in the UK's legal order, a lock if you like, with the ability to choose not to incorporate. But of course that would have countervailing consequences for the arrangement as a whole, and would need, and I'm sure Parliament would want to look and think about that very seriously. I mean, if I may just say on the mechanism that backs that up is the facilitated customs arrangement. And as I think you'll know, the idea is for the UK to apply the UK tariffs and trade policy for goods intended for the UK, and the EU's tariff and trade policy for goods intended for the EU. And obviously, the remittance formula and the remittance mechanism would need to be agreed reciprocally with our EU partners. But I think that gives you an overview, hopefully.
If I might just one, and perhaps I should, for the record, declare that I still have farming interests. And we've obviously seen, for example, the agri-food position in the island of Ireland as well as in the UK. That's one thing, looking at the existing, as it were, acquis of common rules. But presumably it also implies, although the details I appreciate might not yet have been worked up, that there will have to be some future dialogue about changes in the EU rulebook in which we will at least have some kind of input into saying, well, this is something that we could map across quite easily into UK conditions, or it might prove difficult for us.
And I think, I forgive me, I don't have it to hand, but I think that there's inclusion of the scope for technical engagement before the conclusion of those rules. Equally, as a whole, the rule book in this area is not one that's changed as fluidly as in other areas, so it's remained relatively stable. But yes, that's something under consideration as well.
Thank you. Lord Teverson, Amendment
Yes, I just wanted to, Secretary, follow up on the rule book. For us to comply with the rule book, those rules are, a lot of them are made by the EU's agencies, and part of the white paper was very much saying that, particularly for the chemicals, aviation and medical agencies, that we still wanted to participate in that. Now, I know this is part of the future agreement rather than transition. I chair a committee which looks at environment and deals with the chemical side, and not just the industry but the whole of that sector, consumers, everybody was very concerned that we should remain part of REACH, but those regulations are made by obviously the chemicals agency. Has the EU shown any sign that we could retain our membership of those, given the fact that we exit them effectively during the implementation period? Is there any softening of that that view at the moment, that we might be able to retain our membership? Well, or is that yet to come?
I think some of the details of it yet to come, but there is certainly an acknowledgement that the EU institutions themselves, and the ones I'm more familiar with, like Eurojust, Europol, have all sorts of association partnerships with other third countries. Of course, they can range and vary in terms of the levels of intensity and how close they are to the membership, the benefits of membership, particularly in some of the sectors that you've described. But again, I read the comments of Michel Barnier about coming to an unprecedented partnership as a recognition that if we're going to have a future relationship which is bright, once we get beyond the, let's call it, for want of a better expression, the divorce stage, and we start looking forward to the brighter future, we're going to need to be a bit more innovative about some of those regulatory cooperation that we'll have. And it's not just in the areas that you've described, but so I think there is a recognition.
I just described the ones that were in the white paper.
Yes, no, well, but
plus Eurojust and Europol.
And I think on financial services and in some of those areas, we'll need to make sure that we've got the right regulatory partnership. But I think there is an acknowledgement on both sides that strictly adhering to what has gone before won't get us to the optimum kind of relationship that we are both looking for. Quite what the contours will be difficult to decide, and you can understand the sensitivities indeed from the EU's point of view. As the UK negotiator, I understand that myself.
Lord Surrey.
I take it from your answer there that you're accepting that the rule book will be a process rather than a precise outcome on a particular day, trying to have a beginning and an ending. But understanding that, there's still got to be a pretty good hard core fairly early on if there's not to be major problems on trade. So I just wonder what your timescale is here. Do you envisage that common rule book being more or less in place quite early on during the implementation period, or even beyond the implementation period?
Oh, well, I mean, the way that we've devised the EU Withdrawal Act is precisely to take a snapshot of EU law at the state or at the point of departure and make sure it's replicated in UK law to avoid any changes in the rules. So I think what you're really seeing in this area is an upfront commitment to the future of staying aligned, subject to both, I think, the technical engagement that I was asked about, but also then the parliamentary oversight of that, which respects the sovereignty issue. So I'm less concerned about that aspect. I think we'll be ready on day one in relation to the Common Rule Book. I think the sensitivity will be making sure that we retain the sovereignty of Parliament, but recognise the consequences of departing significantly from it.
But there will need to be changes in it, won't there, in the rule book?
Well, as I said before, it's proved relatively stable over time, but that's why we would need to make sure that when there are changes and variations, that I think we have some input into what they may be, so our EU partners and friends understand what the UK equities are, albeit we're not going to be part of the decision-making process as you would if you were an EU member, and at the same time making sure that you've got the ultimate parliamentary lock, but mindful in this place and the other that that would have consequences for the broader agreement. All of those bits, I think, are part of the contours of what we agree on this. But they're all deliverable, but they do involve a compromise, and this is the big compromise we're making.
Consequences a couple of times. The consequences are that the arrangement with the agreement with the EU would fall apart if we chose to diverge from the so-called common rule book, which is actually the EU's rule book.
So I think what you would risk is, in the first instance, triggering the dispute resolution provisions, and in the last instance, proportionate countermeasures, which of course could lead to suspension of material aspects, if not the whole of the deal. So that's why the parliamentary lock is there in place. But if you end up with a set of rules which are not aligned, then that would of course have significant consequences for the rest of the agreement.
So it's an illusory parliamentary lock?
No, it's a lock with consequences, depending on, of course, the nature of the rules and quite how equivalent they may be, and all the rest of it. But that's why you need to have consultative mechanisms through the governance arrangements, both which incorporate all the dispute resolution considerations, but also to make sure we've got some engagement before. So what we're trying to do is make sure that we've got a mechanism in place to iron out any of the easy creases and depoliticise and resolve amiably, to preserve the future relationship, any of the more significant issues. That's one of the big reasons why, and the big choice that we've impressed upon the EU, and I'm reasonably confident that we'll deliver on this, is that arbitration ought to be the model rather than the lopsided ECJ jurisdiction for governing disputes. Obviously, when it comes to points of interpretation, we'll need to be mindful of the EU principles that inform that interpretation. We'll want clear and consistent interpretation on both sides. But I think the arbitration mechanism is incredibly important for making sure that we've got a fair and not a lopsided way of resolving disputes, precisely because on both sides we want to manage our relationship for the future, not just deal with ad hoc tensions as they arise.
And since we have to adhere to the EU rule book, is there any practical possibility of us entering into free trade agreements with other countries which would require a departure from the EU rule book?
Yes, just to give you one, but a very clear advantage we'll have is that we'll have control over our tariffs.
Yes, no, in regulatory terms, which is where a lot of the negotiations generally happen in terms of free trade agreements.
Okay, but you're talking about the regulatory aspects which would be predicated on the Common Rule Book, whereas there are a whole range of others, including services, where we would have far greater freedom, notwithstanding the provisions that we want to include on services with the EU, and then you'd have tariffs which for the most part are reasonably low, but not always, and there's wide areas of or large numbers of both agricultural and industrial goods where the tariffs are substantial. So that gives us quite important leverage for those free trade negotiations. Well, you may disagree, but we've had quite positive comments from other quarters and a lot of interest. So what we're trying to do is come up with a pragmatic approach which retains the level of trade we've got frictionless at the moment, also helps us deal with the Northern Ireland issue, but gives us the ability to strike new trade deals with other parts, growth markets of the future from Latin America to Asia. And that's what this balance as a whole strives to achieve.
Baroness Neville-Rolfe.
Thank you for your comments on agencies, from which I took some comfort. And I think you should add the European Food Standards Agency to your list, because if you think about horse meat and things we need in the future to have collaboration together. I wanted to keep probing on the facilitated custom arrangements. You kindly outlined your approach, but perhaps you could talk a little bit more about how they would work, including the sort of frictionless element that you touched on, and explain what incentive there is for the EU to enter into such agreement, not only obviously the Commission, but the most important member states in terms of moving this agenda forward.
Well, in terms of the way it works, the UK applies the UK's tariffs and trade policy for goods intended for the UK and the EU's tariffs and trade policy for goods intended for the EU. So in practical terms, what that means is that where a good reaches the UK border and the destination can be robustly demonstrated, for example, by a trusted trader, it will pay the UK tariff if it's destined for the UK and the EU tariff if it's destined for the EU. Where a good reaches the UK border and its end destination isn't robustly demonstrated at the point of import, it will pay the higher of the UK or the EU tariff. And if it's later identified to be of the lower tariff jurisdiction, it will be eligible for repayment, which is why the issue of the remittance formula agreed with the EU and the remittance mechanism comes into play. Why would that be interesting for the EU? I think in lots of these areas, the EU and the UK interests are intertwined. I think certainly on the commercial side they're intertwined. I think the EU trade surplus with the UK provides a very powerful overarching dynamic, which means that many EU continental exporters to the UK want to obviously continue selling as frictionless way as possible. And I think also, let's not forget, it's not just about businesses. One of the things I would say about the whole debate about the EU, when we talk about the economic partnership, we talk a lot about businesses, and this is incredibly important, and I've welcomed the really positive, constructive engagement I've had with businesses since the Chevening event we put on the first week, I think, of my appointment, and subsequently. And indeed, many of the businesses have been positive in their response to these proposals. But also, I think we should bear in mind what this means for consumers, because capitalism is, in my view, fundamentally there to serve consumers, not just businesses. And actually, this will be very important for them as well. And keeping frictionless trade and as low tariffs and barriers to trade as possible, incredibly important to consumers, whether they're here or on the continent.
Mm-hmm. I think there's a lot of truth in that, but obviously Michel Barnier has stated that the EU cannot and will not delegate the application of its customs policy and rules, etc., because we wouldn't be subject to the sort of necessary governance structures. How do you get round that?
I think he was quite careful with his choice of words, and I'm not. Again, I'm certainly not paid enough to be the interpreter of the lead negotiator in the EU. But Again, I understand the practical concern the EU has. They can't abdicate, delegate, or give us the power to police their borders. I'm not sure. I'm not sure he was seeking to rule out anything, and I'm pretty clear in our mind that we're not seeking that through our set of proposals. Our set of proposals would want to respect the autonomy in the EU. Indeed, they've been configured in a way which is striving to do just that. So we'll try and work through some of those practical questions, which I understand have been raised from Michel Barnier and his team.
One of the striking things about both the Chequers approach and the EU approach is the differentiation between goods and services. You seemed earlier to say that that was a certain advantage for the UK economy, but actually a lot of those sectors do not see it in that way and have deep general concerns about things like intellectual property and the mutual recognition of qualifications and data and so forth, and some very specific concerns about their own sectors, and this ranges from lawyers through to ballet dancers. And
was that ballet or belly?
Both, actually. And I really wonder what you think Michel Barnier means when he says, as far as the EU is concerned, the services sectors will be operated autonomously by both sides, and in another place he says they will be under the jurisdiction of the host state, which is not actually the same thing as being under the jurisdiction of European rules, because for a member state, European rules would trump the member states' rules, but they wouldn't for a third party. And some of the service industries are extremely concerned about these things, and as are the problems for consumers. You rightly emphasise consumers just now. The consumers of these services, for example, the health service and health service facilities within Europe, I don't quite understand why both sides seem to be differentiating the common rule book for services, or not the non-appliance of the common rule book to services, from that of goods and agri-food.
Well, firstly, on that, to answer that point directly, it's because with cross-border services, you're not affected by frictions at the border in the same way as you would be for goods, and that impacts on the trading relationship, but also has a read across to the position in Northern Ireland.
But on regulations, it is.
Well, I understand, and on more broadly, what we propose in the white paper is, I would say, an ambitious and mutually beneficial set of arrangements. There is some detailed proposals on digital, which you mentioned, financial, professional and business and other services. We've also said that we would need to have safeguards in there to protect service suppliers and investors from unjustified barriers or discrimination. There would be mutual recognition of professional qualifications under our model. And of course, on financial services, we're looking to build on the EU equivalence regime that currently is in place, and which is quite a patchwork in its current state and form. And so we're looking for something more ambitious than that. I think the final point I'd say on services is that obviously for the EU as it's configured now, the single market in services is far less well developed and completed than it is in goods and some of those other areas. So I think that's also grounds for drawing the distinction that we have.
Just on financial services, the reaction to the Chequers proposition has been quite differentiated within the financial services. Some have thought it as a good way of going forward, and some have been highly critical. What's your balanced view of the reaction in the financial sector?
Well, you can always, as I've learned in this debate, there'll always be negative voices. It doesn't matter how positive the outcome. We had the meeting in Chevening, and we had overwhelming positive response to the white paper proposals. But of course there's one or two dissenting voices, and they're the ones that get magnified in the media. That's fine. But what I would suggest is that actually this is a sustainable model for a credible model for an enduring relationship. I think for some of the bigger financial service providers, they're already looking at whether they need a subsidiary, however small, in order to circumvent all of these risks. So some of that is already taking place. But the ultimate acid test is confidence in the city and in the UK as a broader provider of financial services. And I would, again, actions speak louder than words. If you look at the Global Financial Centres Index put out by ZEN, actually, London is still top. There is no EU financial centre in the top 10. And I think ultimately, if we ended up with some of the worst case scenario outcomes that some people have suggested, so that the EU would take this as an opportunity, and by the way, I don't believe this, but to try and either hive off large areas of the work that's done in London or punish the city. I think the only winners would be the other global centres in the top 10, like Tokyo and New York. And I think, by the way, in my experience, there's quite a lot of recognition of how intertwined our financial services are with the continental economy, which is why I don't think that is to be those sort of, I'm not going to use the word fear-mongering, but those sort of concerns have been, at least in some quarters, over-exacerbated. Actually, we've got rather an interdependent financial services with the rest of the continental economy, and I think that's why ultimately we'll come to a sensible arrangement on this. So at least on one estimate, £1 trillion worth of UK financial services investment going into the continental economy. I think people would need to think very seriously about the impact of trying to choke that off, not just on businesses, but also, as I said, the consumers that rely on those businesses in the EU.
Oh, Chris.
Let me follow that up with two more specific points about services, I think. One is about health. And the White Paper states that the government wishes to see reciprocal access to healthcare continue, but says nothing about how this will be achieved. So how seriously is the government taking the interests of consumers within the health system?
Well, I think it's always a balance, and this is probably one of them where we want to give as much detail as possible, but without hemming ourselves in order to be able to come up with innovative arrangements. But if you mean in relation to things like the EHIC card and things like that, those are very much under discussion. I think that they're advantageous to both sides, and I'm reasonably confident with goodwill on all sides that we can come up with a set of solutions that will be good for the healthcare consumers in the way that you described.
Yeah. Well, let me ask the sort of related question then about the financial services, which you've already touched on, where we've got Monsieur Barnier saying future market access will be governed by autonomous decisions on both sides, not only on granting equivalence decisions, but also at the time of withdrawing such decisions. Again, a whole series of practical questions arise there, and I've heard comment from people in the city about how are you going to ensure that there will be coordination of that happening, and so that you're not affecting market stability when people are making those decisions. And you said something earlier about getting the right regulatory partnerships within this. How do you see that working? And do you see new institutions needing to be, new arrangements needing to be established? Or?
Well, I think, and without giving away too much more of the detail beyond the white paper, I think what you clearly need is mechanisms and arrangements between the two sides to be able to discuss proposed changes before they hit the statute book on either side. And then you'll need, and I suspect with these things that prevention is better than cure in the vast majority of cases. And then when changes are made that create particular specific problems, you need to have a mechanism in the governance arrangements to handle it sensitively, to resolve the dispute, the particular dispute, but to try and depoliticise it so it doesn't upend the broader relationship. What we don't want to do is get to the situation where it has a more tectonic impact on the broader relationship, given how broad and far-reaching it will be. And so the challenge that we're both engaged in is to come up with enough detailed and sensitive institutional arrangements to make sure that we can resolve disputes, preserve relationship. And I think, from my experience as an international lawyer, that's the acid test. And arbitration, obviously, is the ultimate model for achieving that. But actually, you want probably a process of dialogue well before then. And I sense that's what you're.
That was the point I was making, and prevention obviously applies both in health and in the financial area, as you say.
I agree with that.
Secretary of State, if we can just go back to the facilitated customs arrangement, if I might say so, I thought that you were very complacent in your answer about how other EU member states would react to this proposal. The customs union is a foundational thing of the European community. It was established in 1958. It took 10 years to bring into effect, and it is absolutely foundational. And what the British government is proposing is, in effect, that Britain should have the right to have all the benefits of frictionless trade from being in the customs union, while at the same time having the ability to vary the tariffs and quotas in order to have an independent trade policy. Now, why should an EU member state agree to this arrangement? It means allowing into Britain goods at lower tariffs than the EU would apply. It means having increased quotas of agricultural products which are seen as a threat to the maintenance of the common agricultural policy. Why should an EU member state agree that these goods can come freely into Britain and then use Britain as a backdoor for access to the EU. What detailed assurances are you able to offer our partners that that would not in practice happen?
So the obvious advantages for this, which are mutually beneficial, are the ones that I've already mentioned in relation to frictionless trade, avoiding the hard border with Northern Ireland. The interests of businesses in the EU, I think, are also paramount. They exported £259 billion worth of goods to the UK in 2017. But to come directly to your question, this is a cup half full, cup half empty issue. So the EU says to the UK, you'll be treated as a third party in the future relationship. And we say, we understand that, that's inevitable as a result of departing the EU. Can you name me a single non-EU country that has ever come to free trade agreement negotiations and offered to be bound by a common rule book on goods and agri-food in the way that we have? Because I think if there would be cock a hoop in Brussels if during the Canadian or the South Korean negotiations or whatever others, there would have been an offer made like that by a non-EU country. Are you aware of any single example where a third country has made that offer to the EU?
Well, we're doing it in order to try and make sure our car industry isn't destroyed. That's the real reason, isn't it? One of the real reasons. It's we are begging for this because without it we know that we will suffer grave industrial consequences. That's the position, isn't it?
Lord Liddell, that is hyperbole. We don't beg, and I certainly don't beg.
And you're saying that the absence of a custom, that with the absence, in the absence of a customs partnership or a customs union, you're saying there would be no problems for vital sectors of our manufacturing industry, despite the statements of the leaders of those industries.
Well, sorry, I think there is a gap between saying there would be no issues and saying it would be a disaster or they'd all be destroyed. I think there's some significant... Hold on, let me answer the question. So we have proposed this model because we think it is the right balance between preserving our trade flows with the EU, but also giving us the ability to strike other free trade deals around the world. We think that this is the best approach. There are other options that, as you'll know, have been considered, and equally we've set out our proposals for no deal, even as we strive and are confident of reaching a deal. I think Britain will be in a good position to thrive come what may, but it is certainly true to say that this is the model that allows us, in our view, the most smooth transition in the short term.
But you've given no indication of how it would work.
Well, we have, and again, if you would like to ask me, I mean, I've tried to answer all your questions as faithfully as I can. If you've got any follow-up ones, I'd be happy either to address them now or write to you later.
Thank you. I think at that point, Baroness Neville-Rolfe.
I just wanted to share this thing that troubles me. So, if checkers for goods, especially for goods, doesn't work, how do we move to sort of Canada plus or some slightly different arrangement, and so as to avoid a no deal? Is there a sort of plan B as you edge forward? Because that, I think, is the worry of a lot of people who are observing this. Look at checkers in good faith. You're moving ahead. You're trying to get a deal. If you don't get that deal, the failure is no deal, which you're going to come on to talk about. Can you edge towards something more like a Canada Plus?
Well, look, in theoretical terms, you've always got the possibility, but we are focused overridingly on the white paper model, which we think delivers the best outcome, not just for the UK, but also for the EU. And as I said, I'm reasonably confident that a deal is within sight. But I appreciate we will want to make sure, as best we can, we avoid the no-deal scenario. Equally, as you'll have noticed, we are intensifying our preparations for that so that we're ready, whatever the outcome from the negotiations. But I do take on board the points you've made.
Lord Surrey.
Thank you. If I could, to security and data sharing. And let me try and contract it slightly by saying I take it we can assume that the UK government will no longer have a governance role in respect of European Union agencies and data sharing systems post-Brexit. That's a fair assumption, is it?
Well, it depends what you mean by that.
Well, I mean quite literally, we will no longer have a governance role. We will not be part of the governing system, will we?
Well, again, I'm going to have to press you a little bit because it depends what you fall within the governance, but we'll not be a member of the EU in any formal sense at all.
We won't have a role in the security systems of the US in terms of deciding what they are. We might have a role in cooperating with them and getting some agreement on how we go, but we will not be able to determine the rules.
You mean the EU, not the US?
Yes, the EU, sorry.
I think that's broadly correct.
Yeah, thank you. So can you tell me now what progress has been made in agreeing the terms of an adequacy regime for data after the end of the implementation period? And whether there are any outstanding matters. It is the adequacy of the terms of the adequacy regime.
We're making good progress, but I can't report yet back on precisely the detail.
Right, let me press you on one particular area which concerns everyone, and that's the European arrest warrant. At the moment, the situation is that the British government is assuming that the European arrest warrant will not be available either to the UK police or to police in Europe after we leave the European Union. That is correct, isn't it?
Can I just, take a half step back? I think in relation to the adequacy notice that you mentioned earlier, you were talking about the data sharing that would be part of the withdrawal agreement, whereas what you're now talking, I just want to be clear, my answer referred to the withdrawal agreement, data sharing outstanding issues, not, for example, some of the other data sharing under the criminal justice part of the future relationship with PNR, PRUM and all the rest of it. So just to be clear about that.
Yes, there is an overlap, as you'll be aware, but I agree that you're making a fair point on clarity. Yeah.
In relation to extradition, we won't be a formal member of the EU, but I think you've actually seen some relatively positive signs and remarks from the EU side about the fact that we want to make sure we retain a fast-track system of extradition. Of course, the challenge is in many respects for the EU side, because if they're going to treat us as a third state in the future relationship agreement, then various other constitutional provisions of different member states will come into effect, because they often insist on greater safeguards than would be applied if you're an EU member state. So, but I don't think any of that will involve a return to some of the older pre-existing extradition arrangements. And actually on both sides, I think we would say that on extradition, on the principles of making sure we can continue fast-track extradition, albeit it won't be the same as membership, is actually one of the positive areas.
Well, let's be clear about some of this. The Schengen information system means we will continue to share information, so the police in Europe and the police in the UK will know when they want, the police want to arrest someone in another country who's a citizen of the UK or conversely of the EU. What they won't be able to do after we leave in March will be arrest that person using the European arrest warrant. And I think the government's already indicated that it knows that, and that somehow or other there's going to be a gap between the time we leave and the time you bring in any other rules about extraditing a person to one jurisdiction or the other. That is right.
I don't think there necessarily does need to be a gap. What we're focused on is making sure at the operational capability level we continue as closely as possible to the high level that we've got at the moment, and indeed as technology and ways of working change over time, we want to be able to strengthen it. I think on the EU side, in fairness, there is a certain legalism which is inherent in the institutional paradigm and the way their perspective. And that's not to be critical. I think if you want to negotiate with the EU, you have to understand that. So we need to make sure that we navigate in a way which respects that. But I think on all sides, my approach has been we want to optimise the operational protection that we provide to our citizens. Seemed to me rather an abdication of our primary responsibility if that wasn't the first and foremost consideration. And I think that there's every reason across both the data sharing, the joint police work that we do, the joint work through Eurojust between investigators and between prosecutors and judicial processes around the EU, and across the gamut, we can actually maintain the highest level of operational cooperation. But you're right, there are some areas, particularly those that attach to free movement, where the data sharing attaches to free movement, where we will come up against some of those legal considerations. my view and our approach is that we need to be focusing on maintaining as much operational capability. Why? Because it benefits the UK as much as the EU. And I think you can see that, and I wouldn't want to politicise this, because we've always said that Europe's defence is UK, the United Kingdom's defence. But I think you can see recently, you look at the last 5 years and some of the counter-terrorism cooperation that's gone on, if you look at some of the links, to give you just one, between Brussels and Birmingham, why on both sides we would want to maintain that operational capability. I personally think it would be a shame if the dry legalism was to disrupt that, and I'm not sure that citizens on either side would thank us for that.
I'm with you 100% on that. That is not the issue, though. The issue is that when you're sharing that information, I'm sure that will go on. That's why I mentioned the Schengen information system and the exchange. What I'm not sure about, what I'm very clear about, is you won't be able to arrest someone who's wanted in either of the jurisdictions. And actually, when you say you're not sure what that is, I was getting some of this from the government document on the future relationship, and where it says in your paragraph 46 that that's the absence of the, in effect, of the European arrest warrant will have to be addressed during the implementation period. Now, the clear conclusion of that is there will be a gap between the coming out of the EU and reaching an agreement. And really what I'm after here is whether enough thought is being given how we can have an agreement, and maybe it has to be a separate fast-moving treaty, to get a European arrest warrant equivalent for when we leave the EU, rather than at some stage further down the implementation period. Because you will have very serious offenders in both the UK and in the EU who can't be picked up by the police, even though they will have the information to do it.
Well, I certainly agree that we want to put in an alternative proposal as soon as possible, and I agree with you. You cited the White Paper. The White Paper is saying there's a challenge there. We will be focused on addressing it. So I hope at least I can give you that reassurance that we're aware of the issue. I'm just saying I don't think it's quite as insurmountable with goodwill on both sides as you're, with respect, suggesting.
But it is a legal issue. You can't arrest.
Lots of legal issues around this. And, of course, we've had issues with the European arrest warrant previously that we've raised with the EU and ironed out through domestic implementing legislation. So, of course, on extradition, there's a lot of the safeguards that apply to it, the triggers that apply to it, they all need to be enshrined as a matter of law. So I certainly accept that.
Right. I would like to pursue that, but I think time means I should simply ask you now, do you think the European Union Commission, or the Commission rather, will continue with its objection to Britain being part of the Galileo project?
Well, look, as you've seen in recent days, we'll be ready for all eventualities. We will be prepared if that position does continue, but I hope good sense will prevail on all sides, and in those areas where there's a mutual interest we can continue to cooperate. That would seem to me a positive long-term perspective for the future, and we're committed to that. But you're right, it depends on the other side for goodwill as well.
Is it a fair assumption to say that because of Britain's very advanced position with the second most advanced aerospace industry, that the real challenge comes from France, and France sees a real opportunity here to develop its also advanced aerospace industry by making sure Britain is excluded from the Galileo project?
I'm sure in lots of these sensitive areas there are economic and political considerations at member state as well as at Commission level, but I'm not going to be drawn into commenting on particular member states, because actually what I'm focused on is the positive and the mutually beneficial outcomes that I think will work for both sides, including our friends north of the Channel. All our friends north of the Channel.
Are you hopeful
south
that
of the
Commission...
Yes, south.
I'm glad I corrected myself before.
Yes, just in time. Are you hopeful that the Commission will move on this, or is that too difficult to say at this stage?
Hopeful, confident, expectant, I don't know. I think there is a dynamic to these negotiations that means that we ought to be making some progress over the coming weeks and months, where some of the more intransigent positions, as the package as a whole starts to look appealing on both sides, I think some of the more intransigent dogmatic positions fold away.
Thank you. Conscious of time, as Lord Soley has already mentioned, I think the three topics we'd like to address, albeit briefly, and of course you can always come back to the Secretary of State if that's easier. One is Lord Tennyson.
So actually, I'm going to ask about no deal outcomes, but perhaps I could just refer to some of your opening remarks where you said that personal relationships are important in these things, and can I say I agree, and I feel that you will get on better with Mr Barnier than perhaps your successor. I think your approach is a good one. Successor, sorry, you know what I mean. Predecessor. You won't have a successor, I'm sure. It will be the end of Dexu by the time you've finished your role, yes. Just on the no deal side, the government is clearly preparing for a no deal. We've had the technical papers come out recently. I'm interested in what you think the circumstances are that might cause a no deal and how likely those are to happen.
Can I just say in relation to your comments about my predecessor,
which I got wrong. Yes.
No, but I understand. I just want to pay tribute because not only is he an old friend of mine, it got me into politics when he lifted me from my days at the Foreign Office to become his chief of staff when we were in opposition. But actually, when I pore over the detail, it's very clear to me the substantial progress that we've made to get the withdrawal agreement into the kind of shape that it is, to get the implementation period over the line. And I want to be on record, if I may, Mr Chairman, about that.
Sorry, while you've done, can I also clarify, I'm a board member of the Marine Management Organisation, which is one of the bodies that will actually have to deal with a no-deal situation in the fisheries industry.
So in terms of what would likely trigger a no-deal scenario, in a way they could be at negotiation levels, diplomatic track, they could be at member states level, could be the European Parliament. There are any number of potential considerations. Equally, we can't anticipate really at this stage what is more or less likely to be the trigger. I think the most important thing is that we have a sober, sensible, risk-based assessment of what the challenges would be, avoid, mitigate and manage them as best we can, and make sure that actually we're having a sensible conversation with the public about risks that can be managed, residual risks that would remain there, and that it can be done in context. Because actually, I think that having started to engage in the public-facing work that we're doing in the technical notices, there is a lot of reassurance that can be provided. Not to suggest that there wouldn't be risks. I've been very clear about that, but that we would be able to manage them and mitigate as best we can. And I think Robert Svedo put it rather well, that it wouldn't be a walk in the park, but it wouldn't be the end of the world. Equally, there's a lot of detail work going on. My focus, as I hope you will see, is overridingly on intensifying the negotiations because we want a strong deal, because we want a good outcome. That's why I'm going back out to Brussels tomorrow evening, and that's why we're picking up the intensity of the negotiations. So really, with the no-deal scenario, as difficult as it is to anticipate what precisely could be the trigger for it, there's a range of possibilities, and we'll be ready for all of them.
Would you like to say what those... I accept there's good faith on both sides to get that agreement. I fully accept that. But what are those triggers? What are those range of possibilities?
Sorry, I thought I touched on this. It could be at the diplomatic level, so in the negotiations, theoretically. It could be at the member state level when it comes to approval. It could be at the European Parliament level. There's all sorts of trigger points. And normally, by hook or by crook, when there's goodwill on all sides and where you've got the contours of a positive deal, you get there. But I don't think we can be cavalier about the risks, and think rather than that, what we want to do is be responsible about it. And I think the responsibility of any government at this stage will be to do and to build up the 2 years' worth of preparation that we've already been doing on the legislative side, on the staffing side, on the institutional capacity, to make sure we're ready for it. The technical notices, in a way, although they gathered a lot of media attention and public attention, actually is the beginning of the public-facing work that we're doing, because we've got to the stage where we need to be talking to businesses, NGOs, public bodies and citizens about the kind of things that, with the lead time that they would have, they need to at least lend their mind to. But that shouldn't detract from our focus. Top priority, overriding priority, get the good deal, and that I'm confident we can.
You said you've got about 80% of the withdrawal agreement to agree. Would you say that's a sort of a similar percentage risk on making a deal or not making a deal, 80-20?
No, I'm not going to put a percentage on it. But I'm stubbornly optimistic.
Okay. Just on Ireland, very briefly, under a no deal, would that mean that there would still be the same commitment on the border if there was a no deal, or how would that work?
We've made clear that we will not see any reversion to the hard border. We would not put additional infrastructure at the border. I think the Irish government have made a similar commitment, and obviously I understand the EU considerations around this, but we wouldn't.
I'm going to go through a couple of things just very briefly because of the timing. As you say, you put out the notice recently, though of course the EU put out its technical notices quite a long time ago. There was no. They're very. This is not a criticism. They're quite general. They make references to other areas and people and organisations, but it doesn't sort of give any idea of scale or impact assessment. Don't you think that's a bit of a weakness when people are trying to understand the implication of these things?
The primary focus of the technical notices is to give information and guidance to the businesses, the NGOs, public bodies, citizens, as to what they need to think about, what they need to do. Because actually, there's things that government needs to do, and there's things that the various different stakeholders I've mentioned need to do. So they are supposed to be signposts, and for that very reason, they're supposed to give clarity, and I think with that clarity, both to signpost the elements of risk, and secondly, what you need to do about it. Actually, we got a lot of positive feedback. I mean, the CBI was quite positive about it. At the press, the speech I gave in the Q&A, there was quite a lot of positive feedback. I'm not suggesting that this is the worst case scenario, but actually to be able to engage and explain what you do to avoid, mitigate or manage risk, and to have quite a lot of positive feedback, none of it picked up by the press, of course, but actually we felt that we'd laid the foundations for the second and third batches of technical notices, which we envisage, but broadly speaking, we think what we've put out in the first batch is around a third of the total that we will come to. So in some of those areas where you've described, I guess I would say there's more detail coming.
Okay. Just personally, the area of no deal that I worry about most is actually not the withdrawal agreement, but the final agreement. We have an implementation period of 21 months. Everybody that I speak to outside the government says to me that's impossible to make an agreement, particularly as it's obviously going to be a mixed agreement within that timescale. So do we have the cliff edge in 21 months rather than on March the 29th?
No, I don't think so. I don't think the EU would have agreed that if it was as undeliverable as you're suggesting. I think what's going to be important, though, in order to make it deliverable, is that there's enough substance and clarity in the political declaration as to the choice of model, whether it's on the economic model that we're making or the security cooperation, so that actually it reads as a direction to the UK and the EU to proceed to the treaty-based arrangements that will be needed for the future partnership. And I think the key is going to be avoiding fudge, having some clarity, and also, as I mentioned before, the linkage between the withdrawal agreement and the future relationship via the political declaration. I think those elements will be important. I think if those ingredients are there, I think actually the treaty-based end result is deliverable.
Baroness Verma.
Thank you, Lord Chairman. Secretary of State, you said that the papers don't always pick up some of the good news stories, but last week you did say that EU citizens will not be turfed out in the event of a no deal, and that the UK had a moral obligation to move swiftly to ensure that the EU nationals are not forced to leave in that scenario. It would be really interesting to hear an elaboration on that, because I think it's excellent that you, as Secretary of State, have made that commitment. And I also would urge you to encourage your colleagues to also talk about the value that EU citizens do bring to our nation. And just on a final note, would you see a no deal scenario see a big drop in our GDP?
So you've wrapped a number of issues there.
I'm sorry.
In very elegant fashion. I think, first of all, in relation to where we'll end up, I'm confident we'll get the right deal. But of course, and the issue of turfing out, by the way, that was put to me as a question by Ben Wright of the BBC, almost as elegant as canny as you. Baroness, but and I was just repeating his words and making it clear, of course, there's not going to be the wholesale turfing out. We would move in those unlikely and regrettable situation to secure the legal position. I can't give you any more on the detail, but what I can say is absolutely the EU nationals in this country who have been here working hard, part of their community. I've been down to Kingston Hospital in my own constituency to talk to them directly, to say that we value them, to say that we want them to stay. That this isn't just a rational statement of our reliance on the contribution they make, but very, very much what we feel in our hearts about them. And I'm happy to continue saying that because it's how I feel about it, and I think it's how the vast majority of people feel about the role and the contribution that the EU makes, and it's certainly this government's position.
And on GDP?
I'm not going to get into the forecasting business. I think that's inherently fluid, but what I'm confident is that, yes, there might be some short-term risk to manage in the way I've described, but I think that obviously the best outcome for the UK would be to leave with a deal, but I'm confident that our best days will lie ahead of us, come what may, in terms of irrespective of the outcome of the negotiations. But the optimum must be for us to get that good deal with the EU, and I'm confident, as I said at the outset of this session, that that's within our sights.
I think two more questions. May Lord Whitty, followed by Lord Little.
Well, we've not heard much about no deal and transport. 7 months tonight, in the event of no deal, what is going to happen at our ports and airports?
Well, so to some extent it will depend on what the EU does, but you will have seen in the technical notices the preparations that we've put out to make sure that we've got the right contingency plans in place. Operation Brock has been talked about, you'll know the details of that. Other practical logistical arrangements have been put in place, and I think the point I would make is that more generally in this area, when it comes to transport, and particularly the logistics between the UK and France, for example, we have dealt with these issues and these challenges before. We've got the French industrial action at Calais in 2015. So whilst the scale may be different, we had the Spanish harvest failure and some of the issues that created in terms of supply of goods and the impact it has on trade. So whilst I'm not suggesting that the worst case scenario, no deal, and the rather vindictive approach that some impute to the EU, but which I never do, wouldn't create a difference in terms of scale, actually we have processes in place to manage this, and we are preparing now for this far enough in advance to be as best placed as we can to mitigate the short-term disruption and make sure that we can then move on and take the advantages of Brexit.
Thank you. Lord Little, final question.
Agreement and the accompanying political declaration. What you suggested is that you want something detailed and specific and therefore very substantial. So are we talking about something that's 5 pages or 100 pages, like your white paper, like the July white paper? What is envisaged?
Well, I'm not sure we'd want 100 pages, but I think putting a page number on it, I'm not sure will be the right approach. What I think is important is that it's clear and specific enough that we're not talking about options for negotiations, but we're clear on the choice of model, and therefore that it reads as a direction to the UK and the EU to get on with it, and that we're really implementing heads of terms, if you like, heads of terms for an agreement. And then the issue is not really some of these more theological questions, but more the detailed implementation. And I think if we get to that stage, I think some of the concerns around deliverability and time frame will be managed down. But likewise, I think the linkage between the withdrawal agreement and the future relationship as it's set out in the political declaration, will be important. So we will look at making sure that it's very clear that that's one package.
Do you recognise that the politics, both in the member states and when you look at the domestic politics here with the divisions there are about what shape Brexit should have, that in fact there will be a lot of pressures the other way to have a declaration that's as vacuous and ambiguous as possible?
But from the UK's point of view, there'll be a good number of people asking, why would you sign up to vacuous, in your words, not mine, or opaque commitments when we've got a very granular and detailed set of obligations in the withdrawal agreement? So I think it's understood on both sides, in order to have some balance, and why we keep saying on both sides there's no deal until you've got the whole deal, that we will need to have a degree of detail and some clear choices that have been made in the political declaration. And indeed, I've had that said to me from the other side as well. And one of the reasons is, I think, as wonderful as the Brexit process has been, I think, on all sides, actually we want to move on to be able to think and deliver and work on the implementation of the positive new relationship, which is the light at the end of the tunnel. And I sense that's the same for the EU as it is for the UK. We don't want the Brexit to be a thorn in the side of our relationship for any longer than is strictly necessary. And that's why I think the political declaration is important, that it has enough specificity and enough detail and enough sense that choices have been made to move us on to turn the corner on some of the more negative sides of the inevitable outcome of the Brexit vote.
Yeah. Secretary of State, in response to the first part of Lord Hill's immediate question, you used the words clear and specific. It will not have escaped you, nor I think members of this committee, nor indeed those listening in, that you've answered for 100 minutes our questions yourself at some intensity and with a degree of clarity which we found very helpful. Even if there are, and of course there will be, continuing differences between individuals as to their exact views on this subject. We're very grateful for your attendance this afternoon. I would just say first that the normal courtesies will be observed. We'll make sure your office has a transcript for correction. You've already undertaken one specific, which I noted in correspondence, which is the question of the EU-UK discussions on the mapping exercise in the island of Ireland, and we'd be grateful for a response on that or anything else that occurs to you. And I think in the light of these discussions, a continuing dialogue with you and your colleagues as we take this difficult process forward. But we are extremely grateful for your attendance and we look forward to maintaining that relationship for a possibly limited but certainly intense period in the future. So thank you. If my colleagues could bear with us for a few minutes longer, we'll have a short deliberate